The moment she stepped in, the manager's eyes scanned her from head to toe. Then came the cold words, "You're in the wrong place." The voice wasn't loud but sharp enough to make a few heads turn. Before she could respond, a security guard appeared, gently suggesting she step outside to preserve the brand image. No one said a word. A few curious glances, a few whispered judgments. She didn't argue, didn't flinch, just looked around silently, then slowly turned to leave. But what they didn't know was that within minutes their smug certainty would collapse, their assumptions would be shattered, and the woman they dismissed as ordinary would become the center of a truth none of them were ready for. Stay until the end to find out. It was a golden afternoon in Beverly Hills. The sun painted the sidewalks with soft shadows as luxury cars lined the street. Inside one of the most exclusive fashion boutiques on Rodeo Drive, the air buzzed with soft jazz and the hum of credit cards swiping. The store was full, stylish women trying on dresses, assistants rushing to fetch different sizes, champagne glasses clinking in the background. And then the door opened. A black woman stepped in, mid-40s, round frame, short natural curls tucked into a modest cap. She wore a faded khaki jacket, worn jeans, and practical walking shoes. Her canvas tote was slung over her shoulder, a bit frayed at the edges. Her presence shifted the rhythm of the room, not because she was loud, she wasn't, but because she didn't fit the usual silhouette. The manager, a slim woman in her 30s with designer heels and a tight bun, noticed her immediately, not out of recognition, but out of reflex. Her gaze lingered a second too long, scanning the woman like a barcode, and then she moved. With quick, graceful steps, she approached. "Good afternoon," the manager said, voice low but firm. "Just so you know, we're currently operating by appointment only. We serve those on our priority list." The woman smiled gently. "I won't take much of your time. I'm just here to browse. I heard you had new handbags in." The manager's expression didn't soften. If anything, her posture stiffened. "Ma'am," she replied, not unkindly, but with polished condescension, "this isn't a public showroom. This is a curated space for discerning clientele." The words hung in the air like perfume, subtle but unmistakable in their intent. A sales associate nearby hesitated. She looked at the woman, then at her manager. She opened her mouth, but one glance from the manager shut her down. The woman's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes dimmed, just slightly. She stepped as if not to obstruct the space, though she had every right to be there. Customers nearby glanced over, some curious, others indifferent. No one intervened, no one greeted her. The jazz music kept playing, but the air had shifted. There was a new kind of silence now, the kind that buzzes under polite tension, the kind that says, "You don't belong here," without anyone having to say it out loud. Still, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply stood there, quiet, like someone who had been through this before and knew how it played out. Her eyes drifted to a display of handbags in the corner, and she took one step forward. The manager intercepted her again, this time a bit closer. "I'm afraid I have to ask you to leave. We're not a public retail outlet." The words weren't shouted, but they hit harder than any raised voice could. The woman took a breath. Her lips parted as if to respond, but she stopped herself. She looked around at the gleaming marble floors, the racks of $1,000 dresses, the people pretending not to notice. And then slowly she turned toward the door. She hadn't touched a single item, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't disrupted anything. But somehow she'd been made into a disruption. As the door swung shut behind her, the boutique returned to its rhythm. But something had changed. A silence lingered. The kind that settles after a line has been crossed, and everyone chooses to ignore it. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't touched anything, and yet something about her presence unsettled the polished peace of the store. The manager, now visibly annoyed, gave a discreet nod toward the back. A tall security guard emerged from behind a mirrored pillar. His steps were slow, deliberate, measured to seem polite, but firm enough to signal finality. "Ma'am," he said softly, his hands clasped in front of him, voice low and rehearsed. "If you don't have an appointment, we kindly ask that you exit the store so we can maintain the experience for our other guests." The woman didn't move. She stood still, her chin slightly raised. Her expression didn't shift into anger, just quiet understanding. There was no confrontation in her eyes, just a softness that hinted at disappointment, maybe even weariness. A few steps away, a white woman with sleek blonde hair leaned toward her friend and whispered, "They just let anyone in here now?" It wasn't loud, but loud enough. One of the boutique guests turned to glance. Another followed suit. No one said anything. One arched a brow. Another gave a half smirk. The rest continued pretending to browse as though this moment didn't concern them, as though silence absolved them. The security guard didn't raise his voice. He waited. Calm, patient, practiced. The woman, still silent, took a single step backward. She looked down for a moment, then offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. With a grace that seemed to mock the store's expectations, she turned slowly. Her steps were steady, deliberate. She didn't look back. The boutique's jazz soundtrack continued playing. A mannequin in the corner cast a long shadow. No one moved. The young sales associate, the one who had hesitated earlier, stood frozen behind the counter. Her eyes followed the woman to the door. Her hands tightened around the hem of her skirt. She looked as though she might say something, but she didn't. Outside, the door swung closed with a faint click. Inside, the boutique resumed its rhythm. The soft murmur of fashion returned. Heels tapped gently against marble. Garments rustled. Conversations picked up where they had left off. But something hung in the air, something unspoken, like dust unsettled by a breeze. Like a truth everyone had seen, but no one wanted to admit. That day, no one had yelled, no one had pushed, no one had thrown insults. But something violent had happened all the same. A woman had been removed, not for what she did, but for how she looked. And everyone saw it, and no one stopped it. What just happened had all the markings of politeness. It was wrapped in professionalism. It was coated in calm. But beneath that surface was something sharp, something cold. And like most sharp, cold things, it cut deeper because it was quiet. Just as the boutique began to settle back into its usual rhythm, the door opened again. This time, a tall man stepped in, clearly foreign. He wore a crisp black suit, tailored to perfection, and a silk scarf tied neatly at the neck in a distinctly French style. His polished toes made no sound on the marble floor, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He paused the moment he crossed the threshold. Standing just inside the door, he scanned the room with quiet alertness. And then he saw her. She was only a few steps from leaving, her back to the boutique, her hand already reaching for the door. But he recognized her instantly. His eyes widened, not with confusion, but with astonishment. Then quickly that look transformed into something deeper. Respect, recognition, reverence. "Excuse me, madame," he said softly, stepping forward. His accent was unmistakably French, his tone gentle, almost unsure. He lowered his head slightly, the way one does when greeting someone of great significance. The gesture was subtle, but sincere. The woman turned, puzzled at first. Her eyes met his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. All across the boutique, heads turned again. This time, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Shoppers paused mid-sentence. Employees froze mid-step. Something about this exchange didn't fit the narrative they had just accepted. There was a shift in the room, a collective inhale. The manager squinted toward the front. Her expression sharpened. She didn't recognize the man, but she could tell he wasn't just another shopper. There was something about the way he carried himself, something that hinted at influence. Still, she didn't move. She just watched. The man gently reached out, taking the woman's hand with both of his voice lowered, trembling slightly. "Pardon me, but are you the creator of Iconic?" The question echoed, not loudly, but with weight. It landed in the boutique like a stone in still water. A ripple of silence followed. Customers stared, staff blinked. Even the music seemed to dim. The manager took a step forward, confusion growing on her face. She was now trying to place the connection, her mind racing through possibilities. But the woman didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look in the man's eyes said enough. His posture, his tone, his awe, it all screamed one thing: importance. And suddenly the assumptions everyone had made began to unravel. They had pushed out a woman they thought was nobody, but someone who clearly mattered to someone like him, someone who spoke her name with such reverence, couldn't possibly be no one. The question, "Are you the creator of Iconic?" cut through the boutique's elegant hush like a blade, and it left behind a silence no one dared fill. The question still hung in the air when the woman finally smiled. It was a quiet smile, calm, unshaken. She gave a small nod, not boastful, not dramatic, just certain, as if she was used to being recognized in unlikely places, as if she had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. The silence in the boutique deepened. The name Iconic echoed in everyone's minds. It wasn't just any fragrance. Iconic was a global sensation. It had sold out in Paris, Milan, Tokyo, and New York. Celebrities praised it. Magazines fought for interviews about it. And yet, no one had ever seen the woman behind it. Until now. The man turned to the crowd, his voice filled with both pride and disbelief. "This," he said, "is Rosa Jennings, the genius behind Iconic." There was an audible gasp from somewhere near the accessories wall. A woman in a designer blazer raised her hand to her mouth. "I've bought 4 bottles this year alone," she whispered, eyes wide. All at once, the boutique's atmosphere changed. Heads swiveled. Eyes darted between Rosa and the manager, whose skin had drained of color. She stood frozen in place, mouth slightly open, utterly speechless. Rosa remained still, her hands folded gently in front of her. She didn't gloat. She didn't glare. She just stood with a quiet dignity, the same way she had when they tried to push her out. Jacques stepped forward again, placing a hand over his heart. "I came all this way to meet her," he said, "to invite her to co-create my next fragrance line. $3 million, guaranteed." The number made a few people audibly inhale. A few others instinctively took a step back. Suddenly, everything about Rosa Jennings, the jacket, the tote, the calm demeanor, looked different. No one dared to meet her gaze now, because every single person in that room had looked at her just minutes earlier with judgment, with dismissal, with that quiet cruelty reserved for those who don't seem to belong. And now they knew who she was, what she was. More importantly, what they weren't. The manager took a faltering step forward. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, maybe apologize, but no words came out. What could she say? Rosa looked at her for the first time, not with anger, not even with pity, just a look of complete clarity. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I could have bought this entire store," she said, her tone even, "but I chose silence." Then she turned to Jacques, nodded once, and began walking with him toward the exit. No fanfare, no dramatic pause, just purpose. Behind her, the room remained frozen. The moment stretched, long enough for every person there to reckon with their part in what just happened. Long enough for the realization to settle. They hadn't just misjudged a stranger. They had exposed themselves. By morning, the story had gone viral. Social media platforms lit up with headlines. "Luxury boutique kicks out fragrance genius." They had no idea who she was. And Beverly Hills store embarrassed after mistaking iconic creator for nobody. The video footage, taken from the boutique's own security cameras, circulated with millions of views. It showed everything. The stares, the rejection, the way the manager tilted her head with disdain. The moment security stepped in, the silence of the crowd. And then, the shift, the recognition, the truth. People were outraged. Influencers, journalists, everyday viewers, everyone had something to say. It wasn't just about fashion. It was about judgment, about how quickly people decide who deserves space and who doesn't. The brand had no choice. They issued a formal apology that same afternoon, admitting an unacceptable lapse in protocol and values, and announced the indefinite suspension of the store manager. But the damage was done. Rosa Jennings, however, refused to hold a press conference. She declined every TV interview and feature request. She posted just one sentence on her personal page. "I forgive," she wrote, "but I do not forget." That was enough. It was shared by millions. Behind the scenes, the boutique's youngest employee, the sales associate who had stayed silent, sent Rosa a private email. She apologized. She admitted she had wanted to speak up, but fear stopped her. She wrote, "I realize silence can hurt more than words. I'm so sorry I didn't say something when I should have. Rosa never replied, but she read every word, and the emails didn't stop there. Letters poured in from women who had been dismissed, from men who had once judged too quickly, from students, from strangers. They thanked Rosa for her patience, for her calm, for not letting anger be her language, for reminding the world that dignity doesn't need to shout. The boutique tried to make amends in its own way. They placed a framed portrait of Rosa in their front display, beneath it a quote in gold lettering: "Worth is not worn, it is lived." Customers paused to read it. Some took photos. Others stood quietly, their faces thoughtful. But Rosa never returned. She didn't need to. She didn't want grand gestures or delayed reverence. She had made her point without raising her voice. She had held a mirror up to the world and let people see themselves in it. For some, it was uncomfortable. For others, it was unforgettable. In the weeks that followed, her story continued to ripple outward. A leading magazine placed Rosa Jennings on its cover. The headline read, "The Scent of Self-Respect." Her face, soft, composed, quietly strong, became a symbol not just of elegance, but of resistance. Not the loud kind, the lasting kind. She didn't move into a mansion, didn't upgrade her car. She still lived in the same small apartment just off a quiet street. Still walked each morning to the neighborhood scent shop where she once tested oils in peace. Still greeted the store owner by name. Still asked about his kids. Still paid in cash. When a prestigious art school offered her a role as a senior consultant, she politely declined. "Give that seat," she said, "to a young person of color who needs a way in." The gesture wasn't theatrical. It was intentional. And like everything Rosa did, it was rooted in belief, not bitterness. Behind the scenes, real changes began. Brands that had once dismissed stories like hers suddenly found themselves revisiting their policies. Internal bias training, customer service audits, recruitment practices. Questions were asked that hadn't been asked before, and then came the campaign. Look Twice. It began as a small nonprofit initiative inspired by Rosa's story. Its message was simple: challenge your first judgment, whether it's someone's clothes, accent, or skin. Stop. Look again. See deeper. The campaign spread fast. Billboards, subway ads, even college orientation programs. And always in small print beneath the bold tagline, "A quiet dedication." For RJ. Rosa didn't lead the campaign. She didn't want to. But she supported it. She lent her name to one international event, a global human rights conference in Geneva, where she was asked to close the keynote session. Standing in front of 1,000 attendees, lights low, room hushed, Rosa spoke for just 7 minutes. She didn't retell the boutique incident. She didn't name names. She talked about choice, about identity, about what it means to walk away with dignity, even when silence hurts more than words. She ended with one line: "Silence was my choice, but justice is what I believe in." There was a beat of stillness. Then the room rose. Thousands of people, all standing, not because she was famous, not because she was wealthy, but because she was right. She didn't cry. She didn't smile big. She just nodded once softly, then stepped down from the podium. And through it all, through headlines, invitations, praise, Rosa remained the same. Grounded, clear, unshaken. Because while the world tried to paint her as extraordinary, she had always seen herself as ordinary, with one simple, unshakable rule: never lose your kindness, not even when the world tries to take it from you. Rosa Jennings' story was never just about a misunderstanding in a luxury boutique. It was a mirror, one that reflects how easily we let assumptions cloud our vision. It was a reminder that prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers behind polite smiles, hidden in policy and tone. And yet, in the face of that quiet dismissal, Rosa didn't shout back. She didn't demand. She didn't fight. She stood still. She stayed calm. And somehow that silence, firm, composed, deliberate, spoke louder than any protest could. Not everyone has the strength to stay quiet in the face of injustice. But Rosa's silence was not weakness. It was weight. It forced reflection. It changed the room, and it changed the story. If you've ever been overlooked, misjudged, or made to feel invisible just because of how you look, Remember this, your value does not depend on recognition. It does not need to shout to be seen. Real worth shines when the world least expects it. What did you think about the crowd's behavior in this story? Would you have reacted differently if you had been there? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters. Your perspective could help someone else see the world a little clearer. Thank you for staying with us through the end of this journey. If Rosa's story moved you, if it sparked something real, hit like, share it forward, and subscribe to Black Excellence. Because the more we tell stories like this, the more we create space for truth, justice, and dignity to take center stage. We'll see you in the next episode.